Jason Clemmons at the Rock Health and Wellness Center, and you are listening to Life with Jason Clemmons, DC, coming to you live every night from 6 to 7 right here from the studios at the Rock Health and Wellness Center. And we're coming to you on 987 radio, 987 something, FM Walk by Faith Radio. Sorry about that. And we're coming out to you from 1420 AM, Lubbock Christian Nation, 987radio.com, and the Live 365 app. And we also are streaming live on Facebook at the Rock Health and Wellness Centers. We're on YouTube at Health from the Rock. And we are on X at Dr. Jason Clemmons, DC. So if you're looking for us out there, you should be able to find us. If you got any family members or friends that need to talk about health, then you should be able to find us out there as well. So we're glad you join us each night. We're really sorry about last night. We were working on some things in the studio, and we had some switches that changed on us that we didn't recognize. And so it kind of took us down for the night. The guys worked hard last night during the show to get us back on track. And we just decided that by the time we got it all fixed, we probably just had to just skip that show and move on. And so the really awesome thing about this show is that's life, right? That's just the way it goes. Sometimes things don't go exactly like you planned them to. And do you have the ability to adapt, to move on? That's really the big thing. So we're sorry about missing that show last night. But every Wednesday night, we have a book review. And so this is our third Wednesday in a row. And we are going to review the book Spark, The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain. And this is by John J. Rady, MD. And I'll break that down here in just a minute. And we'll get into the book. Our first book that we broke down was The End of Alzheimer's by Dr. Dale Bredesen. If you'd like to go back and watch that show, it should be archived on our Facebook page, the Rock Health and Wellness Centers, or you should be also be able to see us on the YouTube channel or on X. And then last week, we broke down The Body Keeps the Score, and it was quite popular with our group of people. We had lots of feedback on that. That was about post-traumatic stress and trauma. And so I hope we did a pretty good job with that, talking about how trauma affects our body and how it affects our brain. And if you hadn't had a chance to go back and watch that one, that'd be a really good show to watch. It'd be good for you to get to be able to see that and see how your brain functions. And then tonight, this one's about exercise. So I'm excited about this show. It's really cool. The copyright on this book is 2008. And so it takes me back a little bit, but I think one of the things that I've learned talking about wellness and the way that we talk about wellness is you just keep having to stack the knowledge that you have over a period of time and just keep stacking it and keep stacking it. And it's like, how did you get to where you are today? You know, how did you get to how did you get to be the guy that you are today? How did you get to learn the stuff that you learned? And that's what I'm trying to do with this show. I'm trying to come to you every night. I know you guys are busy. A lot of you guys are out running around at ball practice and doing all kinds of stuff tonight. Got things to do with your kids, or you're going out to dinner, or I don't know. I know I'm also competing with America's Got Talent and all the rest of that stuff on these nights. So, but if you go back and you watch the show just a little bit, and you take some time to watch the show over a period of time, I think what you'll start to develop is an understanding of wellness. And it is very, very uncommon in this world today to understand what wellness is. And just some of the things that happened to me this week, I was going to mention them last night, but we didn't get to do the show. And so I thought I wanted to, before we get started on the book, I just wanted to talk about some of those things, because people that come get adjusted on a regular basis, that you think, well, maybe they're picking up some of this stuff that I'm trying to share with them. And one of the guys, it was really cool. It was really cute of him. He just got a new pellet grill, and he was proud of that pellet grill. It was a gift that he had gotten from his brother. And he said, man, I never did want one of those pellet grills, but then my brother gave me one, and it's awesome. I just can't wait to get home and cook. And so he showed me his phone, and he was like, look here, this is what we cooked this weekend. And the first thing he showed me was roasted corn. And so he was like, man, that came out perfect. he's like, don't you think that looks good? And I looked at it and I was like, that's interesting. And then the next thing he showed me was this big roast. And he said, look at that, 97 cents a pound. And I was like, that's interesting. And then he's like, here's a big old pan of rice. And I was like, that's interesting. And he was like, why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep saying it's interesting? Right? And I was like, well, that's a lot of omega 6s that you got going on right there. And that's a lot of carbohydrates that you got going on right there. And if you're thinking about wellness, I'm like, here, first of all, you didn't get a grass-fed roast for 97 cents a pound. I know for sure. So whatever roast you got, that wasn't a grass-fed animal. And so that animal was a grain-fed animal, which means that animal's high in arachidonic acid, which means it's high. You're going to end up with inflammation when you eat it, right? So that's the first thing is like we might want to get a grass-fed animal. Second thing is you might want to change out those omega 6s in that corn for maybe asparagus. Like eat some broccoli or some cauliflower or some zucchini or squash or something like that. Move that into a direction that's going to take you away from those omega 6s. And then we might want to skip all those carbohydrates that we got going with that. See? And so it's just a different world. And he was like, when he left, he was like, well, I guess we need to go do the shop with the doc that you mentioned when we first started. And I just kind of laughed. I was like, yeah, that's exactly right. So maybe we need to go. Maybe we need to do one of our shows right here at the shop with the doc, so that we can break down some of this stuff. Another one of the episodes or conversations that I had this week was with a wife, and she was talking about her husband who had come in to see me, and he had a bum shoulder, and she was talking about him going to the VA, and she said, I can't even tell you how many medications that he takes. Like he takes medications for anxiety and depression, and he takes blood pressure, and he takes sleeping issues or acid reflux. And I don't know. She broke them down. She broke down several different thoughts right there. And I just saw the guy this week, and he's a 50-something-year-old guy, and he's relatively fit, good-looking fella. And I was just thinking, I'm a 52-year-old guy, and I've had one Tylenol in the last 23 years and one Advil. Took Advil one time in the last 23 years, and I've had 3 antibiotics in the last 23 years. And there's no more pharmaceuticals whatsoever that's going in. That's part of my life, right? And I was like, it's just interesting the difference between one person and the next person. And the thing that really convicted me, the thing that really bothered me, is just knowing that he's going to the VA, and the answer is to put him on drugs. And one thing that I wanted to just present for consideration for those of you that are listening is that you can't count on your provider. You can't count on your provider to necessarily make the best wellness choice for you. You can count on your provider to make the best medical choice for you. That's what they're going to do. They're going to make the best medical choice for you. But it's just nearly impossible to be on the same page when you're talking about wellness. I had another new patient on Tuesday, and she had to give me a list of the medications that she's taking. And she has diabetes, and she has neuropathy, and she's got SI joint pain, and she's just on a whole slew of medications. And I'm like, has anyone ever worked with you on your diabetes? And she said, oh yeah, my medical doctor's working with me on my diabetes. And I said, how's he doing that? And she said, well, he's got me on metformin and wanted to do some shots and all that stuff. And I'm like, no, ma'am, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about working with you with your diabetes that way. I'm talking about working with you with your diabetes to get rid of your diabetes, like to solve your blood sugar problem and to get your body back into a state where your diabetes goes away. That's what I'm talking about. And she's like, well, no, then I've never had anybody help me with that. And, we've said on this show multiple times, and I think everybody knows it by now, and I hope so. And I'm going to keep saying it every week just so everybody that's listening understands. I'm not treating diabetes, right? That's not my game. I'm not telling a person to take drugs or not take drugs. but I am talking about wellness, and wellness is my game. And the detection and correction of the subluxation or interference in the nervous system, that is my game. And if you have neuropathy, you have interference in your nervous system. And if you have type 2 diabetes that leads to neuropathy, then you have interference in your nervous system, and that's my game. That's what we do right there. Right now we can help you, and now we need to help you, or it's just going to get worse. And so the thing that bothered me was going to the VA and getting more medication and more medication and more medication. And I'm like, how is that helping that person? And you just can't count on the docs or the nurse practitioners or whoever it is that's doing that. And I'm not coming at them personally. I know they're good people that are trying to do good in the world, and I'm not coming at them, but we're not in the same game. The wellness game and the medical game is not the same game. And it doesn't matter how they doctor it up or how many big old hospitals they build and call it wellness and all the things that they do. If your end result is a medication, then you're not working on wellness. So if you really need to be working on structure, you need to be working on your brain, you need to be working on your diet and your exercise. And those are the things that are going to move you towards wellness, regardless of how old you are. And so that's where we come in to the book that we've got tonight. And the book that we're breaking down tonight is, again, it's called Spark: The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise and the Brain by John J. Rady, MD. And I've had this book for several years. It's copyright 2008. And Dr. Rady is an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and an internationally recognized expert in neuropsychiatry. He has published over 60 peer-reviewed articles and 12 books published in 20 languages, including the groundbreaking ADD-ADHD Driven to Distraction series with Ned Hollowell, MD. Their latest release, ADHD 2.0, that was released in 2021, explores new science and strategies. With the publication of his bestseller, Spark: The Revolutionary New Science of Exercise of the Brain, Dr. Rady established himself as one of the world's most foremost authorities on brain fitness connection in areas such as ADHD, autism, aging, and cognition. Recognized by his peers as one of the best doctors in America since 1997, Dr. Rady was recently honored by the Massachusetts Psychiatry Society as Outstanding Psychiatrist of the Year. And advancing the field, Dr. Rady and his work are frequently profiled in the media, where he's been featured on ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, and NPR, as well as the New York Times, Newsweek, Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, Men's Health, and other national publications. Dr. Rady maintains an active practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Los Angeles, California. He's a really neat guy. He studied Zen thinking and mindfulness at one point in his life, and he's done a lot of work. And what is really cool about the book is that it's basically a book about exercise, but the big deal, the idea of the book is that exercise is good for your brain. That exercise, let me say it again, exercise is for the brain. And that's what I got from the book when I read the book the first time. It was talking about, it's not exercise is good for the brain, it's that exercise is for the brain and the things that happen inside the brain whenever we exercise. And a lot of times we don't think about that. And I think we might have mentioned that early on one of our very early shows, that a lot of times people say, man, I need to go do some cardio. Like I need to go get on the treadmill and do some cardio, right? Or I need to go for a run and do some cardio. And really what they should say is, I need to go for a run and do some neuro. We've got that named incorrectly. We say that we're going to do some cardio when really we're going to do some neuro. And Dr. Rady does a fantastic job of breaking down exactly what happens when we exercise in the book. And I'm going to go through some parts of the book. I've highlighted some things in the book that I think is really cool. And so, but what got him to write the book is he heard about this school district just outside of Chicago called Naperville. And some of the people that run the school district in Naperville, they decided that they were going to start exercising the kids. They thought it was a good idea. They just were just like, man, we really knew we need to do this, um, and get this thing going with the kids. And when they started it in 2003, they were the national average of obesity for children was 33%. And I don't even know what it is today. I think it's pretty close, 37% or something. We're still in that same realm when it comes to obesity for kids. And it just seems to be getting worse, right? Well, these folks at Naperville Independent School District, they decided that they were going to start exercising their kids. And so every morning they would, when they got to school, before the school bell started, like their 0 hour or whatever they called it, they would take and have these 8-minute sessions, and they had different things going on. They had basketball, they had pogo sticks, they had jump rope, they had hula hoops, and for 30 minutes they would just, every 8 minutes or so, they would just blow the whistle, and the kids would just rotate, and the kids would go from one station to the next station, and they would work out for 30 minutes before they would go to school, and then they would go to school. And they dropped their obesity rate in their school district to 3% just by getting the kids to exercise. But what really got Dr. Rady inspired was their test scores improved, and their discipline problems dropped by 83%. When they started looking at their suspensions and their discipline problems dropped by 83%. And so it was an interesting thing. And then there's this test in science and math, the International Science and Math test, and you can choose. It's done with multiple countries around the world. This test, and Naperville decided that they would join as their own country. So I guess whoever administers the test doesn't really matter if the whole country doesn't want to do it. You can just choose to be your own group. And after they took the test, they ended up number 1 in science and number 6 in math in the world, right there outside of Chicago in Naperville. And so Dr. Rady he was like, man, this is something else. What exactly is happening over there? And so he went to find out, because he'd known about this study that they did at Duke University, where they took a group of incoming freshmen at Duke that really weren't very active, and they put them in 3 different groups. They put one group in that was taking Zoloft for their depression. And then they took another group that was doing exercise 4 days a week for 30 minutes. And then they took another group that did the medicine and the exercise together. And after 4 weeks, all of them are on the same level. They got their depression scores came down to the same exact level. And after 4 months, the changes had remained. And so they took what this Duke study was they took a group of those kids, and instead of giving them medication for their anxiety and depression, they gave them exercise 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week. And what they found was it's just as good or better, because there's no side effects from the exercise. I mean, you might get a blister on your foot or something like that if your shoes don't fit right? Or, maybe if you really overdid it, your muscles might get sore a little bit or something. But just by doing aerobic exercise 4 days a week, 30 minutes a day, that's as good as taking Zoloft. And so he knew that study. Then after he heard about the kids in Naperville, then he decided, man, I got to go check this out. I got to go see exactly what's going on. And what he did was he just was like amazed. He got in there and started talking to the superintendent and the people in charge of the exercise program, the PE coaches, and all that sort of thing. And the book describes that in the first chapter, about how everything, just their whole performance, all of their suspensions, all their discipline problems, and all that just almost went to nothing. And then there was another school district that heard about Naperville, and they implemented the same program, in their district, and they got the same exact results. And they had a class that they actually had for their 20 worst kids. Like they had these they had a nickname for them or something about the 20 troublemakers or whatever they were. And by the time they got finished, I don't think they had anybody left in that class, or there was just one or two kids in that class after the exercise. So the suspensions went down and the attendance went up. All of a sudden, the kids thought it was cool to learn something. All of a sudden, they had motivation to learn whenever they started exercising. And that's where he started getting into the brain and what does exercise do for the brain. And that's what's so cool for me, because I was like, I just thought, man, this is really awesome. So he goes through in the book, and I want to give you as much information about the book as I can, so you can feel like you've read it by the time we're finished. But in the book, he goes through, and each chapter kind of breaks down a different condition. So after the welcome and in the beginning, the second chapter is learning, and it's grow your brain cells. So he gets into it. I'm going to read some of it here in just a second, but he gets into exactly what happens inside the brain, right? And then chapter 3 is about stress. Chapter 4 is anxiety. Chapter 5 is depression. Chapter 6 is attention deficit. Chapter 7 is addiction. That's a good one. Chapter 8 is hormonal changes, the impact on women's brain health. Chapter 9 is aging, the wise way. So now we get into the putting off of or keeping from happening Alzheimer's disease, right? And then in chapter 10, then he gets into the regimen of how you actually build your own brain. And so it's really cool. A lot of these things, I mean, is that the first thing that we think of? Is that the first thing that we think of when we have a child that has ADD or ADHD? Do you think of 30 minutes of exercise a day, 4 days a week? Does the second grade teacher or the third grade teacher at your school, is that the first thing they think of? Do they come in and say, "Man, this kid can't sit still and he can't pay attention. I think we need to exercise him 4 days a week, 30 minutes a day." You know, that school that copied Naperville, instead of having time out, they had time in. They actually put you in time in, meaning you had to go get on a treadmill. If you were misbehaving, you had to go get on an exercise bike, and you had to start pedaling and start exercising until you calmed down, until your brain calmed down. And I thought, how's that? I mean, I'm not real sure that's what we do. I'm not real sure that we think about depression as something that we should exercise ourselves out of. I'm not real sure we think of cancer as something that we should exercise ourselves out of. I've got a patient that's got cancer that's new to us this week. And no, I'm not treating his cancer. His medical doctor's treating his cancer, but he did get sent to me. And one of the things that keeps running through my mind about this guy is that he should walk himself right out of cancer. Like that ought to be part of his treatment plan, is to get your shoes on and walk yourself right out of it. See if you can walk yourself right out of your cancer. And I think that would be a huge thing for him, is to get moving. So when we break down all these conditions, attention deficit, addiction, hormonal changes, if you're going through hormonal problems, you ever thought about working out? If you're 50 years old and you're going through menopause, is the first thing you think about, I need to get 30 minutes of exercise 4 days a week. I don't think that's normal. At least in my experience with the groups of people that come to see us, that I don't think that's a normal thing. I don't think that's the first thing, right? Especially women, especially women going through menopause. Everybody knows that's a delicate little situation right there. So you should be very kind and patient and understanding if you're a man going through menopause right there. But you might not want to just might want to be tactful if you're thinking about recommending exercise to your wife when she's going through menopause. She may or may not take that very well, depending on the level of hormones that she has at the moment that you bring it up. So we might consider that might be touchy about how you might approach that right there. So, but I don't think it's something that is very common when we break it all down. And I know we talked about Alzheimer's as being something that exercise is a big part of that, and that goes back to our breakdown of Dr. Bredesen's book. So we got a little break right here on the radio that we're coming up on. So when we get back from the break, I'm going to start in chapter 1 and start talking about the neurotransmitters in the brain and how they're affected by exercise. And we get into things like dopamine and serotonin and glutamate and GABA and those things, that you might take things like Ritalin for, or or some of your other Prozac, some of those things. There might be some other drugs that you might take. You might think about, well, I'm going to take Ritalin, or I'm going to exercise for 30 minutes. And there's no side effects from the exercise, but there might be some side effects from the Ritalin. And the Ritalin didn't solve the problem that caused us to be ADHD in the first place, right? So maybe we might need a little bit of exercise that goes with that. So we're going to take our break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes on the radio, and I'll stick with you on the Facebook. Yeah, the things that exercise does for us, according to this book, Spark, exercise makes your brain better, keeps your brain cells young, prevents onset of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, allows the brain to be plastic, and allows us to learn. Actually, there is a one of the first books that I read when I was working in wellness that said that we actually create new brain cells in the brain. Our hippocampus, which is a big part of memory and integrating experiences in our past, our hippocampus is will actually grow cells whenever we exercise, and it will actually shrink whenever we don't exercise. So you can actually build brain cells when you exercise. You can increase your brain learning capacity by exercising, right? Brain cells sprout, especially in the hippocampus. The fitter you are, the better learner you are. And one of the things, since we're on the break from the radio station, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that is my whole entire life, I've gotten comments about um, dumb jocks, right? I was a football player from the time I was in first grade. I started baseball the year before I was in kindergarten, and played baseball all the way through high school, and I played football all the way through college. And I always hear this statement about how dumb athletes are, right? Or how dumb football players are. And I don't want to get into. There are some guys that maybe weren't, magna cum laude in our class or whatever that played sports. There's a lot of guys who were sharp as heck. There were a lot of guys in athletics who are great students, who were 4.0 students, who were top of their class in business, and are really good businessmen today. Wall Street guys, millionaires, business guys, and I just think, how much did exercise contribute to their brains? Because that's one of the things that Dr. Rady says in the book, is that the fitter you are, the better learner you are. So all those laps we ran in Jones Stadium and up and down that ramp in the summer and over there on the track and all the things that we did right there, that might have had something to do with my GPA in college. And I'll say it like this: who knows how bad it would have been had I not been working out. That might be the better way to say it. I might want to think it that way. Be thankful. Thank goodness that I was working out, because man, without it, we might have been really in trouble. So I'll take that either way. Either way, that works out for me. So, but that is something that makes our brains better, right? Um, the big thing about the school districts was that suspensions went down and attendance went up. The kids, and that gets into what dopamine does for us. And dopamine, it gives us a reward for wanting to work out, for wanting to be able to do that. That's that's kind of what dopamine is about right there. So, okay, everybody, we're back on the show. Thanks for listening to us tonight. And we're breaking down the book Spark. You're listening to Life with Jason Clemmons, DC. We're breaking down the book Spark by Dr. John Ratty. And so I'm just going to read some of this first chapter so you can learn about the neurotransmitters. And it's all about communication. The brain is made up of 100 billion neurons of various types that chat with one another by way of hundreds of different chemicals. And if you think about that for a second, that's really amazing. Like your brain is made up of 100 billion neurons. There's a lot of stuff going on right there. And some of the chemicals that are in your brain, one of the chemicals that is in your brain is glutamate. And glutamate stirs up activity and begins the signaling cascade. And gamma, I'm not going to go through all that. It's called GABA. GABA claps down on activity. So there's two different chemicals in the brain. One of them is called glutamate, and glutamate makes neurons active. And the other one is called GABA, and GABA makes neurons calm down. And so we move into these other transmitters that have an effect on whether we're getting glutamate or whether we're getting GABA. And that's where we get into things like serotonin, norepinephrine, which is the adrenaline in your brain, right? So you get some adrenaline from your adrenal glands, but that's what we call epinephrine in your body. But the norepinephrine is what the adrenaline is in your brain. And then the last one is dopamine. And although the neurons that produce them account for only 1% of the brain's 100 billion cells, the neurotransmitters have a very powerful influence. They might instruct the neurons to make more glutamate, or they might make the neurons more effective or alter the sensitivity of the receptors. And that's really a big deal right there, right? So is the dopamine going to excite the brain, or is the dopamine going to calm the brain down? And is the serotonin going to excite the brain, or is the serotonin going to calm the brain down? Those are things that it is. It's a next step in the biochemistry of our brain, right? And so they can deliver signals directly, like glutamate and GABA. We're talking about the serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. They can deliver the signals directly, but their primary role is in adjusting the flow of information in order to fine-tune the overall balance of neurochemicals. So that's what they're trying to do right there. They're trying to fine-tune whether or not our brain is functioning at a high level or at a low level. And when you break down the brain from the right side to the left side, and we've talked about this in the past, that the right side has an affinity for the norepinephrine, and the left side has an affinity for the dopamine. And then that's going to drive the glutamate and the GABA inside the brain. Serotonin is kind of like the policeman of the brain because it helps keep the brain active, the brain activity under control. It influences mood, impulsivity, anger, and aggression. We use serotonin drugs, such as Prozac, for instance, because they help modify runaway brain activity that can lead to depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. So serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters, one of those hormones that is actually in the brain that kind of controls that right there. So if we don't have very good serotonin levels, then we have a hard time controlling those aspects of our life. And what we want to do is we want to go directly to Prozac, right? We want to go directly to some sort of pharmaceutical to deal with those things. And what the book talks about is how we get that. We increase those levels whenever we exercise. Exercise is one of the things that does that for us. Norepinephrine, which was the first neurotransmitter scientists studied to understand mood, often amplifies signals that influence attention, perception, motivation, and arousal. And that's something that I think is kind of cooler to know. Is that norepinephrine has an affinity for the right side of the brain, and the right side of the brain handles 4 of the 5 levels of attention. And so if you want to increase your attention, you can increase your norepinephrine, your adrenaline. I know sometimes it's hard to understand exactly what those words mean, but that's a big thing right there, is that we can would amplify the signals that influence attention, perception, motivation, and arousal. And that comes from norepinephrine and it's really on that right side of the brain. And then dopamine, which is thought of as the learning, reward, satisfaction, attention, and movement neurotransmitter, takes on sometimes contradictory roles in different parts of the brain. And that's where Ritalin comes in. And it's very similar to Ritalin. Ritalin eases attention deficit hyperactivity disorder by raising dopamine, thus calming the mind. And remember, I think we might have touched on this on a previous show. Focused attention is on the left brain. Focused attention. And so when a child is having a hard time focusing, they're not paying attention, or they're distracted by everything that's around them. They're distracted. What's happening is they've got overactivity of their right brain, and that's what's causing them to pay attention to everything that's around them. And they have underactivity of their left brain, which is causing them not to be able to focus on something, right? So they've got a heightened sense of the norepinephrine. They've got a heightened amount of activity with norepinephrine in the right brain, which norepinephrine is most of the time is, I don't know if most of the time is the right way of saying it, that it is stimulated by stress. Whenever we enter the stress response, we stimulate norepinephrine into the brain, and that fires up that right brain, remember, because that's the unknown side of the brain. And so we get into that unknown side of the brain by firing that stress response, which makes us pay attention to our periphery, and it takes away from the activity on the left side of the brain, which is our focused attention. And so what do we want to do? We want to take Ritalin for attention deficit disorder to increase the dopamine on the left side. Well, when you do that chemically, you start getting into that cascade of downregulating that dopamine. And that's, I hope someday, and if you've dealt with this, or you got kids that dealt with this, I just hope someday we kind of get to the point where we understand what that means. When we give a child an external drug to increase dopamine, then what that leads them down the road to taking a drug to increase dopamine. That leads them down the road to taking an alcohol, which increases dopamine, driving a car fast, which increases dopamine, eating sugar that increases dopamine, right? We really, if we could figure out as a group, if we could really understand that external driving forces of dopamine is bad for us, and finding a way to decrease the stress and kick that neurotransmitter, kick the information from the right side to the left side. I think that's something that's so cool about wellness, is it just stacks on top of itself and stacks on top of itself and stacks on top of itself, right? The learning that I do is so inspiring to me because it fits all together. It's kind of like studying the Bible. It's like you don't ever find something that contradicts it. And when you think it's not contradictory, you're the one that's got the problem, not the Bible, right? So the same thing that happens in wellness is you're not finding contradictory information so much, is that you're finding this stacking of stuff. Like we know we've gone over it multiple times on the show, the right side to the left side brain, right? But that's what Dr. Rady's saying right here, is that we're taking Ritalin to ease attention deficit hyperactivity disorder by raising dopamine, thus calming the mind. Well, how about raising dopamine by exercise? How about getting that child to exercise their way? Because exercise increases dopamine. Exercise increases serotonin. Controlling the microbiome in the gut, because most of our serotonin comes from little cells that are in the lining of our gut. That's where we get 90% of our serotonin is from our gut. And if we're eating a bunch of refined carbohydrates and we've got leaky gut problems and we've got microbiome problems inside our gut, then our gut-brain connection gets all messed up and our serotonin gets all messed up. And then we have all kinds of problems right there, right? So Most of the drugs we use to improve mental health target one or more of the area of the three neurotransmitters. That's what Dr. Rady's saying. But as I hope to make abundantly clear, simply raising or lowering the levels of neurotransmitter doesn't elicit a crisp one-to-one result because the system is so complex, right? Manipulating just one neurotransmitter causes a ripple effect that takes different paths in different brains. Exactly. When you think you're going to be smarter than your innate intelligence and you think you're going to be able to control that, you're really rolling the dice on that deal, right? It's not really how it works. And then one of the biggest things that he discovered, or he discovered in the process of learning and writing this book, was as fundamental as the neurotransmitters are, there's another class of molecules that over the past 15 years or so has dramatically changed our understanding of the connection of the brain, specifically how they develop and grow. I'm talking about a family of proteins loosely termed factors, and the most prominent of this, which is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. So BDNF is what Dr. Rady calls the miracle grow of your brain. Whereas neurotransmitters carry out signaling, neurotrophins such as BDNF build and maintain the cell circuitry, the infrastructure itself. So one of the big takeaways from the book is that exercise increases BDNF, the little chemical in your brain that builds the infrastructure of your brain, that maintains and builds the cell circuitry. And so he calls it the miracle grow. So when you want to get ready to learn something, you want to have your brain circuits in top shape. You want to have them firing the way they're supposed to fire. You want to have the neurotransmitters working in the way that they're supposed to work. And that's what Naperville did. Naperville was able to control their test score. They was increase their test scores and decrease their discipline problems by exercising first thing in the morning before they went to school. Like when the kids got to school, before they went to the classroom, they exercised them. Like how simple would that be? How simple would it be just to take every kid in our school district and every kid in every school district that's here, and the first thing we do is we have them exercise for 30 minutes before they go to class, right? And they didn't have to run around the track. They didn't have to do that type of work. They could simply jump rope, double Dutch jump rope, and a basketball station and a pogo stick station. How fun would that be? How fun would it be to go to 7th grade and have a pogo stick station that you could do for 8 minutes and then switch over and do the hula hoops? I mean, and what they found was if you do it in a social environment, you increase the chances of wanting to do it more, and you increase all of these neurotransmitters. I mean, how awesome is that? What do we say the number one thing for your brain was in a previous show? The number one thing for your brain is to be social. The number two thing for your brain is to walk, right? That is not massively complicated. And one of the things that we have with our kids today is they're not social. They're on social media. They're getting likes and they're having a lot of friends and followers and all that stuff, but you put them in a room together and they can't even talk to each other, right? Can you imagine what it's like to go to school? I don't even know it. It'd be crazy what it's like to go to school. But what if the first thing we did when we got to school is 30 minutes of exercise? And Dr. Rady says if we did that, we would drastically decrease our discipline problems and we would drastically increase our test scores. So the BDNF, about a dozen papers on BDNF were published before 1990, the year the scientists discovered that it exists in the brain and nourishes neurons like fertilizer. That's what he calls the miracle grow. BDNF was present in the hippocampus, right? We mentioned that already. So learning requires strengthening the affinity between neurons through a dynamic mechanism called long-term potentials. When the brain is called on to take on information, the demand naturally causes activity between neurons. So we increase neuronal activity when we're about to learn something. The more activity, the stronger the attraction becomes, and the easier it is for the signal to fire and make the connection. The initial activity marshals existing stores of glutamate in the axons to be sent across the synapse and reconfigures receptors on the receiving side to accept the signal. So there's our glutamate right there, right? So when we're about to learn something, we're fixing to activate these neurons in our brain, and we're going to get that glutamate and kick it across there. The voltage on the receiving side of the synapse becomes stronger in its resting state, thereby attracting the glutamate signal like a magnet. So that glutamate transfers from one nerve to the next, and that's what keeps it firing through right there. If the firing continues, genes inside the neuron cells are turned on to produce more building material for the synapses. And if this is bolstered of the and it is this bolstering of the infrastructure that allows the new information to stick as memory. And I know I'm just reading verbatim right from the book, but I think it's really important. It's a good learning experience right there. That's how we build brain. We build brain. There's actually a mechanism inside of our brains that we can build and get better. So he uses this example. Say you're learning a French word. The first time you hear it, nerve cells recruited for a new circuit fire glutamate signal between each other. If you never practice the word again, the attraction between the synapses involved naturally diminishes, right? Say it for the first time, you fire the neuron, but you don't practice it, it just kind of goes away, weakening the signal. You forget. The discovery that astonished memory researchers and earned Columbia University neuroscientist Eric Kandel a share in the 2000 Nobel Prize is that repeated activation or practice causes the synapses themselves to swell and make stronger connections. I mean, we all know that. Remember when we were in third, fourth grade, we would write our spelling words 10 times on the page, write it over and over and over and over and over again. Do the play over and over and over again. Shoot the basket over and over and over again, right? The more you do that, the stronger the connections. A neuron is like a tree that instead of leaves has synapses along its dendritic branches. Eventually, new branches sprout, providing more synapse to further solidify the connections. So that was really cool. The other thing that exercise does, and he breaks down, is what happens in the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is responsible for balance, coordination, and posture, right? That's the little part of your brain in the back that when you start to get older and you start to lose your balance, you start to lose that cerebellum. And you also start to lose that prefrontal cortex right there. So when we exercise, particularly if the exercise requires complex motor movements, we are also exciting the areas of the brain involved in this full suite of cognitive function. So the cerebellum and the prefrontal cortex are working together. So then whenever we exercise, we're actually firing both of those things at the same time. One of the tricks, if you've got little kids or grandkids, one of the things that can happen to your kids is they've got so much visual stimulation these days while they're sitting still and doing nothing. So when they're sitting there, and like when Jacob was little, we used to watch Blue's Clues all the time, and he'd get in his thinking chair and he'd have his handy dandy notebook, and we'd watch Blue's Clues when he's 4 or 5 years old, whatever, right? Well, one of the things that I made him start doing is get a ball and put the ball in his hand. And he had to play catch with himself. He had to hold that ball or throw that ball up and down or do some sort of coordinated movement with the ball while he was watching Blue's Clues. Because what will happen to the kids if they're learning and their upper brains are developing and their cognitive part of their brain is developing, but they're not moving, their cerebellums don't stay up with their prefrontal cortex. And they get an imbalance between the two, and that causes lots of problems for them as they age. So when I was a kid, we used to play cops and robbers out on our bikes, right? We used to play cowboys and Indians, and I don't think you can say that anymore, but that's what we used to play back in the day, right? Well, we were making up the rules while we were moving. So it was constant moving. We were playing mechanical man or tackle the man with the ball or whatever in the front yard. So we had all these rules going on that we were having to learn cognitively while we were on our feet moving. Nowadays, the kids don't do that as much. Nowadays, the kids sit there and absorb and absorb and absorb and absorb information into their brains, but they don't fire their cerebellum because they're not on their feet and they're not coordinating that movement. And that can cause a problem for them as they get older. So the prefrontal cortex is the boss. As such, it is responsible for, among other things, keeping tabs on our current situation through so-called working memory, inhibiting stimuli, and initiating action, judging, planning, predicting. All executive functions. As the CEO of the brain, the prefrontal cortex has to stay in close contact with the chief operating officer, the motor cortex, as well as many other areas. The hippocampus is something like the cartographer, receiving new input from the working memory, cross-referencing that information with existing memories for the sake of the comparison, and forming new associations. So they found out that the hippocampus actually grows whenever we're exercising, and the hippocampus actually shrinks when we're not. So that's a super important part of what's going on in the brain. And so basically, this first part of the chapter kind of explains to us how all the rest of those things, like depression, like anxiety, and those sort of things end up, right? Anxiety, depression, the ADHD, all those things that he breaks down in every chapter are all the addiction, hormonal changes. All of those things are related to those neurotransmitters, the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine, the glutamate, the GABA, and all of those things get better when we exercise. So he takes the whole book and he breaks down every part of it and tries to get us to understand that, hey, if you're exercising, that's what you're going to solve a lot of those problems. He goes through and talks about guys that were marathon runners that injured themselves, and once they injured themselves, then they couldn't. That what they started to find out is all of a sudden they developed ADD and ADHD, and then they came to him. They were like, "Man, what should I do? Should I take some Ritalin or some Prozac or something like that for those things?" And he was like, "No, you need to get back and exercise." And so once they got back and exercising again, then those things went away. They were inhibiting all those problems by getting out there and moving and exercising, right? So the regimen, what do we do? What do we do by taking all this information? Well, one of the things that Dr. Rady is a scientist, and he does a lot of work in the lab. So a lot of the stuff he does is with mice, and it's really difficult with mice to have them. One of the things he says is it's really hard to get mice to lift weights. So they were asking him, is aerobic exercise or anaerobic exercise better? Should we go hard and fast, or should we go slow and sustained? And that was his answer, is like, well, it's really hard. It's really hard to do experiments with mice and have them lift weights. So most of the activity that he talks about is aerobic. So there's different modes of aerobic exercise, but when he gets into walking, jogging, and running, and you could do any of that stuff. And when he talks about walking or low intensity exercise, he's referring specifically to exercising at 55 to 65% of your maximum heart rate. And one simple way to to measure your maximum heart rate is to take 220 minus your age. So however old you are, subtract from 220, and that's going to give you a number. And that's kind of a simple way to detect your maximum heart rate. So when you're walking, you want to walk at 55 to 65% of your maximum heart rate. Moderate intensity falls into the range of 65 to 75% of that number, while high intensity goes into the 75 to 90% of that number. That's why I love CrossFit, and that's why we do CrossFit in the gym, is because we're able to do all of those systems in the CrossFit workout. So we can go high intensity and we can move it down into aerobic, which means really basically longer than a 3-minute period of time. And it bases on, so if you want to know how to do that, take 220 minus your age. Walking is 55 to 65. Moderate intensity falls into 65 to 75, and then high intensity is 75 to 90. And so that's the book. We're running out of time on the radio. I'm gonna stick around just for a second on the Facebook part and kind of finish this regimen so everybody that's watching there can catch us. And I really appreciate you guys listening, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. Thank you guys, and have a great day. So for our Facebook group, um, it it's really kind of simple. That's basically the regimen that he talks about, is just getting yourself moving in one of those phases. Um, Walking, the process of getting fit is all about building up of your aerobic base. The more you work your heart and lungs, the more efficient they will become in delivering oxygen to your body and brain. So if you haven't been doing any exercise, just get to walking. Walk for 30 to 45 minutes a day. See if you can do that 4, 5, or 6 days a week. See if you can walk at that. See if you can take your heart rate. So, however old you are, and let's just say let's just do the math for you, right? So it's 220. Let's say you're 60 years old. Say 220 minus 60, you're at 160. So let's take 55% of that. So 88. So if you're walking and you get your heart rate to 88 beats per minute, and everybody's probably got a smartphone at this point, right? It could tell you where you are. And so 220 minus 60 times 65%, 181 beats a minute. Hold on a second. I did that wrong. $104 beats a minute. So if you wanted to get into that moderate level, you could move up into that 104 beats a minute. And then you could do the same thing with 75 to 85 to 95%. So if you haven't been exercising, then that's an easy way to do it. Just start off walking. And if you'll just start walking, you'll start firing your brain, and you'll start increasing those hormones. You'll start increasing dopamine. And what dopamine will do for you is it will encourage you to walk again tomorrow. One of the things that I learned from Dr. Huberman, Dr. Peterson, was just by walking, just by doing a routine, like something as simple as making your bed in the morning. If you'll just make your bed in the morning, the task of making your bed releases dopamine that gives you motivation to do something else. And then that little bit of motivation gives you motivation to do something else. And then you'll start to naturally build those dopamine levels up inside your brain, and you won't be looking for sugar and alcohol and all the rest of those things that fire those dopamine pathways. I can promise you that's how it works. You'll just go all day long and you'll feel great about what you're doing. You're not hungry all the time. You're not having these weird cravings all the time, and you'll get dopamine. It was really, really funny last night. My daughter was saying something that she was wanting some berries, or so, I don't know what she was saying, something about something that was telling me that she had a lack of dopamine. And I said, just look at my face. You'll get dopamine from me just by looking at my face. And she just started laughing. She was like, I'm not real sure that. She said, you're a little overconfident right there, aren't you? It was kind of funny. It was a joke, but anyway, the key thing is when you start working out, you're going to start getting those hormones functioning in your body. You're going to start building that brain-derived neurotropic factor, that BDNF, and you're going to get yourself ready to learn something new. You're going to get yourself ready to increase your brain capacity. That's inspiring for me at 52 years old. Like, I can be smarter at 53 than I am at 52. And you can be smarter at whatever age you are than you are right now. And one of the simple things you can do to get smarter is just go for a walk every day. That will make your brain better. That will make you smarter. The smarter you are, the better chance you got to function in this world. It'll keep your brain healthy. It'll keep Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease away from you, and you might just walk yourself right out of cancer. I appreciate you guys listening. I hope you might have learned something from the book. And if you got any questions, send me a text, 806-794-0400. And otherwise, I will see you guys tomorrow night.